Melissa looked at her husband as if trying to see the man she had once married. When had he become such a stranger? Or maybe he had always been this way and she just hadn't noticed before. But now it didn't matter. Clayton, if we buy an apartment, we register it in both our names, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Otherwise, I'll take my share of the money. We both saved up. We sold my grandmother's apartment, which means I contributed more. But you'll be the sole owner? Clayton rolled his eyes in irritation and shrugged. Melissa, you're so materialistic. What difference does it make whose name is on the papers? We're a family. Keeping track of who contributed what is just absurd. We're one, aren't we? Melissa remained silent. Her fingers clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She pressed her lips together, trying to stay calm. If it doesn't make a difference, then why should the apartment be in your name? She asked, watching his reaction closely. Clayton froze as if he hadn't understood what she had just said. Because I want it that way, he finally blurted out. A man is always the head of the household. Melissa crossed her arms over her chest. Once she would have silently accepted his decisions, suppressed her own desires, and believed in his authoritative, I know best. But now it all seemed absurd to her. Clayton, enough. We live in the modern world. Either we put the apartment in both our names, or we don't buy it at all. He tried to say something, but she didn't let him continue. And by the way, you could start saving money too. It wouldn't kill you to go without beer for a month or two. His eyes widened in shock. For 9 years, Melissa had been quiet, obedient, practically submissive. And now, out of nowhere, she dared to argue? He gritted his teeth. It must have been her friend Nora's doing. Clayton couldn't stand Nora. She was blunt, unafraid to ask uncomfortable questions, and always looked at him like he was an annoying inconvenience. Tension filled the room. Melissa sat by the window, gazing at the darkening horizon. More and more she found herself thinking that their marriage had become a facade. Clayton came home later and later, and his excuses became less and less convincing. She wasn't stupid. She knew there was someone else in his life, but what was she supposed to do about it? One day she shared her worries with her friend. Nora, if Clayton leaves, what will I do? How will I go on? She asked in a trembling voice. Nora just shrugged, looking at Melissa with a hint of irony. You're already not living. You're just existing. Clayton has always only thought about himself. You work 2 jobs, earn more than he does, and he still acts like you should be grateful to him. What do you owe him? He's my husband, Melissa said quietly, lowering her gaze. Husband? Nora scoffed. When was the last time he did anything for you? Bought you flowers? Took care of you? Melissa stayed silent. She already knew the answer. Exactly. He wouldn't care if he got bored of you tomorrow. He'd just kick you out. Nora's words stuck in her mind. Melissa remembered who she used to be. Confident, vibrant, determined. Once she could have moved mountains. And now? Now she was just a shadow of her former self. Meanwhile, Clayton felt in control. Melissa was convenient, quiet, always supportive. He was convinced he had everything under control, even when she insisted the apartment be in both their names. He agreed, but secretly resented her for it. In reality, Clayton was living a double life. He had a young, attractive woman who demanded gifts, fancy dinners, and trips. His debts and loans were piling up, but he kept telling himself it was temporary, so long as Melissa remained compliant. Eventually, they bought the apartment. It was spacious, bright, with large windows, a place he was proud of. He walked through the rooms with a victorious air until one day, Melissa brought up a new topic. Clayton, I think it's time we considered having a child, she said casually. He turned to her as if she had just suggested something insane. Are you out of your mind? Look at these walls. We haven't even fully furnished the place, and you're talking about kids? Melissa fell silent, feeling an emptiness spread through her. Her voice was weary. You just don't want kids, ever. Clayton smirked, not even bothering to argue. A year passed. The apartment was filled with cozy details, but it brought no happiness. Clayton spent fewer and fewer nights at home. Melissa noticed he had grown colder, and the silence of their evenings together became suffocating. One night he came home late and said, I'm leaving. I want you to move out. I need the apartment. Melissa looked at him, searching for any trace of tenderness, but there was nothing left. This is your choice, Clayton, but I'm not moving out. This is my apartment too. He stood in the middle of the room, blinking in confusion. You have no one. You never will. You should obey me. Melissa took a step toward him, looking him straight in the eye. Those are your words. I won't listen to them anymore. Take your share. Get a divorce, but everything else is no longer your concern. Her voice was cold, her gaze like ice. Clayton realized there was no stopping her, but the words were stuck in his throat. Melissa left the room, leaving him bewildered, and for the first time in a long while, she felt strong. Several months had passed since Melissa declared she wasn't going anywhere. Clayton decided to let things be for now, convinced that he would eventually find a way to force her out. He was certain that her resolve was just a temporary outburst that would fade with time. But with each passing day, Melissa became more distant and cold. Her indifference irritated him because, in the past, she had always agreed, accepted his demands without question. Now she didn't even lift her gaze when he lashed out. Her silence was heavy and oppressive, as if her thoughts were somewhere far away. The apartment Clayton had once been so proud of seemed to be changing him. He no longer felt like the master of his own life as he once did. All he wanted was for things to return to the way they were. It infuriated him that Melissa no longer ran after him, no longer pleaded, no longer tried to smooth things over. One night he came home even later than usual. The clock read 3 a.m. The hallway was dark, but he could hear someone quietly breathing. Melissa didn't get up to heat his dinner like she always used to. She didn't even come out of the bedroom. Before, she would always wait for his return, like a loyal dog. He suddenly felt like a stranger in his own home. The thought struck him like lightning. What the hell flashed through his mind? The next day, he decided to go all in. Melissa, he began, barely masking his irritation. I found a buyer for my share of the apartment. She glanced at him over her shoulder, calmly continuing to fold the freshly washed laundry. Clayton hesitated. He had expected tears, hysterics, begging, but her indifference felt like a slap in the face. I'm signing the contract tomorrow. You'll have to move out anyway. The new owner will decide what to do with you. Melissa simply nodded, as if his announcement was about something distant and irrelevant. Meanwhile, she was battling panic. Clayton's words might have been an empty threat, but she knew he was more than capable of following through. She remembered him saying once that he wouldn't stop at anything if there was profit involved. Anger simmered inside her, but she couldn't let herself give in to emotions. The next morning, Clayton left early and Melissa stayed home. She couldn't shake the feeling that something unknown was waiting for her. She heard the front door open, but instead of Clayton, a tall man stepped into the hallway. He looked around before noticing her and awkwardly took a step forward. Excuse me, are you Melissa? He asked, a little uncertainly. She stood up, feeling a slight dizziness. Yes, and who are you? Edward, he introduced himself. I bought half of this apartment. I hope we can come to an agreement. The evening was strange. Edward turned out to be reserved, almost shy, but firm in his intentions. He suggested they discuss how they would live together until they figured out what to do with the apartment. I work on a rotational schedule, he explained. I'll only be here for a couple of months a year. The rest of the time, the place is all yours. Melissa sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly flipping through a notebook when she suddenly noticed a scratch on its surface. A knife mark. They had bought this table when they first moved in. Back then, it had seemed like a symbol of a new chapter in life. Now it just looked worn out and battered, much like Melissa herself. Edward pulled food out of a bag and started preparing dinner in silence. Melissa watched his movements, noting how confidently he handled himself in a kitchen that wasn't his. You're settling in fast, she said for the first time that evening, smiling slightly. Edward turned, surprised by her tone. I hope it doesn't feel like an intrusion, just trying to ease the tension a little. Over dinner, Edward shared that he had been searching for an apartment in a good neighborhood for a long time. He admitted that he had no idea about her difficult situation with her ex-husband. I've been through something similar myself, he said. That's why I hate seeing people in pain. Melissa suddenly felt vulnerable. She had long since learned to hide her emotions, but his words touched something deep inside her. After dinner, they cleared the table, and Edward wished her good night before heading to the room he had chosen for himself. Melissa remained sitting in the kitchen, thinking about how their strange cohabitation would unfold. She realized that, for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. The next day, Melissa felt strange. She couldn't quite pinpoint what was bothering her. Was it Edward's presence or the realization that their shared living situation might last longer than expected? For the first time in years, she found herself with someone who was willing to listen rather than give orders. It felt unfamiliar. Edward turned out to be quiet, almost unnoticeable. In the morning, he got up early, made his bed, washed his coffee mug, and left. Melissa only heard the front door click shut. She felt embarrassed admitting it to herself, but after so many years, she wasn't used to this kind of orderliness. Clayton, on the other hand, had always left a mess behind. His dirty socks could be found anywhere, and the sink was often filled with dishes he was too lazy to wash for weeks. Melissa had always cleaned up in silence, convincing herself that these were minor things, not worth fighting over. But now, in comparison, she felt an odd sense of relief. She walked into the kitchen to make herself a morning coffee, but stopped when she noticed a note on the fridge. In large, slightly uneven handwriting, Edward had written, "If you ever want to talk, just text me. I'm around." Edward. Melissa smiled absent-mindedly. A simple, polite reminder with no pressure. She took a picture of the note on her phone, not knowing why she did it. A few days passed, and they barely crossed paths. Edward would come home late at night, barely greet her, and disappear into his room. Melissa tried to understand what kind of person he was, but couldn't find a reason to start a conversation. There was a tension in the air, as if both were waiting to see who would speak first. One evening, she heard a quiet knock on her door. "Melissa, sorry to bother you. Could you help me with something?" She opened the door and looked at him in surprise. "Did something happen?" "No, everything's fine. I just can't find one of the pots," he admitted, scratching the back of his head a little awkwardly. Melissa smirked, feeling like the real owner of the house for the first time. She walked into the kitchen and immediately noticed the missing pot on the top shelf. Edward clearly hadn't thought to check there. "Here it is," she said, handing him the pot. "Maybe I should show you where everything is." Edward smiled, accepting her help. "I'd appreciate that. I feel like a stranger here." Melissa unintentionally reflected on his words. This apartment hadn't felt like home to her for a long time either. With Clayton, everything had felt foreign, from the furniture to the small details. But looking at Edward, she felt something close to comfort for the first time in years. She gave him a brief tour of the kitchen, showing where everything was. Edward listened carefully, occasionally making light jokes to ease the tension. Melissa suddenly realized that she hadn't felt this at ease with someone in a long time. After that, their dynamics started to change. Melissa no longer felt so tense, and Edward began appearing in the common areas more often. One evening, he suggested cooking dinner, and Melissa agreed. As they cooked together, they started talking. Edward shared that he worked in the North on a rotational basis. Living in harsh conditions had taught him to appreciate comfort and simplicity. Melissa spoke about how she and Clayton had once moved into this apartment and how her dreams had slowly faded. "Have you ever thought about leaving everything behind and starting over?" Edward asked as he carefully stirred a sauce on the stove. "I have," Melissa admitted, "but I was afraid. It's scary to change things when you're used to holding on to the past." Edward looked at her thoughtfully but said nothing. When dinner was ready, they sat down to eat, and Melissa noticed how warm and cozy the apartment felt, for the first time in years. The food was just food, not another obligation completed out of routine. Edward told funny stories about his work, and Melissa suddenly found herself laughing. It was like a breath of fresh air she hadn't realized she needed. A week later, Clayton showed up at the apartment door. He looked irritated and was clearly not expecting a stranger to answer. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, not hiding his hostility. Edward didn't rush to respond. He calmly looked Clayton up and down before answering. "I'm Edward, the owner of half this apartment." Clayton opened his mouth to say something but froze when he saw Melissa step out of the kitchen. She looked calm, even indifferent. "Why are you here, Clayton?" she asked, looking him straight in the eyes. "Just checking how you're doing and seeing how things are," he muttered. Melissa let out a restrained smirk. You never really cared about how I lived. What changed? Clayton felt his anger rising. Oh, look at you, getting all bold, he hissed. Think you found yourself a protector? Edward, without raising his voice, said, It's better to talk in the kitchen than cause a scene in the hallway. Clayton clenched his fists but followed them inside. The tension in the kitchen was palpable. Clayton sat down, shooting an annoyed glance at Edward, who calmly poured himself a glass of water. Melissa remained standing, crossing her arms over her chest. She hadn't seen her husband like this in a long time, but for some reason, his anger no longer scared her the way it used to. So what did you want to discuss? She asked dryly, clearly wanting to end the conversation quickly. Clayton hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully, but finally spoke. I sold my share of the apartment to Edward, he said, motioning carelessly toward the man. But that doesn't mean I'll forget how you pushed me out. Edward watched silently as Clayton tried to appear confident, though his voice betrayed irritation. Pushed you out? Melissa repeated, genuinely surprised. I seem to recall that you were the one who left, saying you needed more space. Clayton gritted his teeth, but instead of answering, turned to Edward. You know what's going to happen to this place? She'll ruin it. Everything she touches turns into a burden. Edward leaned back in his chair, giving a restrained smile. I think you're underestimating her. Everything looks pretty well kept to me. Clayton fell silent, unable to find a response. He wasn't used to being contradicted so easily, especially not to someone defending Melissa. He felt like Edward was doing it on purpose, putting on a show just to humiliate him, and that only fueled his anger even more. You don't know her, he finally muttered through clenched teeth. She talks a good game, but in reality, she's a complete zero. Melissa wanted to object, but Edward spoke first. Maybe we shouldn't talk about someone like this while they're right here. It's not exactly polite. What do you think? Clayton jumped up, ready to unleash another wave of accusations, but Melissa raised her hand wearily. Enough, Clayton. If you wanted to prove what a hero you are, you failed. Leave. He froze, as if he couldn't believe she had actually said that out loud. She used to always smooth things over, trying to calm him down, but now a different woman stood before him. You'll regret this, he said quietly, shaking his head in warning. That's my choice, Melissa replied calmly, not even trying to soften her tone. Clayton lingered for a few more seconds, then abruptly turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. When the tension in the room finally eased, Edward looked at Melissa carefully. You, okay? She nodded, but her hands were still shaking. It took her a moment to realize just how much that conversation had rattled her. Thank you for not giving in to his provocations, she finally said as she sat down at the table. Edward shrugged. Guys like him feed on emotions. If you don't give them fuel, they lose interest. Melissa thought about that. He was right. Clayton had always believed he could manipulate her with fear or guilt. But today, for the first time, she saw him falter in the face of her composure. I thought that conversation would drag on forever, she admitted quietly. Edward smiled. You handled it better than you think. His words were unexpectedly warm, and suddenly Melissa realized something. He had done what she hadn't felt in a long time. He had made her feel confident. Weeks passed. Melissa and Edward gradually adjusted to living together. He turned out to be disciplined, someone who followed clear rules. Surprisingly, Melissa even started to trust him, something that had always been difficult for her. One evening after finishing work, Edward suggested they go for a walk. Fresh air helps reset the mind, he said, pulling on his jacket. Melissa hesitated but eventually agreed. They strolled through the evening city, talking about random things. She felt surprisingly at ease. At the corner near a small cafe, Edward suddenly stopped. How about we go in? My treat. She wanted to decline, but his offer sounded so casual that it seemed silly to look for an excuse. Over a cup of hot tea, Melissa told him how she had once dreamed of leaving the city when she was younger, but had stayed because of Clayton. Do you regret it? Edward asked. She thought for a moment. Not anymore, she answered. Honestly, I'm even glad things turned out the way they did. It made me rethink a lot about myself. Edward nodded, not pressing her with more questions. Meanwhile, Clayton was seething. He had been certain his words would shake Melissa, knock her off balance. But it seemed his plan had backfired. Not only had she not reacted, but she had also found the strength to stand up to him. "She's doing this on purpose, just to humiliate me," he muttered under his breath, staring out the window. But deep down, he knew that wasn't what really bothered him. What truly gnawed at him was the fact that Melissa had crossed a line, one he had always assumed was her limit. He saw now that she was capable of so much more, and that realization wouldn't leave him alone. His thoughts kept circling back to their last meeting. At one point, he even considered trying to win her back, but he quickly pushed that idea aside. She wasn't the same woman she used to be. With bitterness, he closed his eyes. Time passed and Melissa gradually returned to a life she could truly call her own. Her days became filled with things she did for herself, not for the expectations of others. Music played in her apartment again, candles flickered in the evenings, and fresh bouquets, ones she bought for herself, appeared on the table. Edward, still living in the neighboring room, became something like a dependable friend. They didn't cross paths often, but when they did, their conversations were light and warm. He didn't ask unnecessary questions or try to change anything in her life, and oddly enough, that made Melissa feel even more comfortable. One evening, Edward was late coming home from work. Melissa was about to go to bed when she heard the doorbell ring. Standing at the door was Edward, a bag of takeout in hand, his face weary but content. "Sorry it's so late," he said. "I just thought we could have dinner together." Melissa looked at him, trying to understand what drove this man. He didn't seem to expect anything in return. He simply enjoyed the company. "Come in," she finally said, opening the door wider. As they sat down to eat, the conversation turned to Edward's upcoming work trip. 56 days in the middle of nowhere?" he chuckled. "But you know, when you come back, everything feels new again. Even the simplest things like a hot shower or the quiet of home feel different." Melissa listened, intrigued. She couldn't imagine such a life, full of constant changes, but she liked the way he spoke about it. "And you," he asked suddenly, "have you ever thought about changing something?" "I have," she admitted honestly, "but I was always too afraid." Edward nodded, as if he already knew what she would say. "Everyone's afraid," he said. "The real question is, what do you do with that fear?" A few days later, Edward left. The apartment felt quiet, but Melissa realized she no longer felt lonely. She started noticing the little things that brought her joy, the smell of freshly baked bread, the warmth of sunlight on her face, the sound of rain tapping against the window. One day, while cleaning out her closet, she stumbled upon an old photo album. Inside were pictures from before her marriage. She spent a long time flipping through them, remembering the carefree, energetic young woman she once was. In one photo, she stood on a bridge, arms outstretched, as if she were about to take flight. "Where did you go?" she whispered to herself. Those thoughts stayed with her all evening. She decided it was time for a change. When Edward returned, Melissa greeted him at the door with a newfound lightness. "You look different," he observed, surprised by her energy. "I think I've decided to take myself back," she replied with a smile. Over a cup of tea, she told him she had finally signed up for the photography classes she had dreamed of for years. She even bought a new camera to start capturing moments again. "That's amazing," Edward said sincerely. "You deserve this." "Thank you," Melissa said softly. Their conversations remained as light as before, but now there was something new in them, a sense of forward motion. Meanwhile, Clayton was still struggling to figure out what to do with his life. The younger woman he had left Melissa for was long gone, and the money from selling his share of their apartment had run out faster than expected. He found himself thinking about the past more and more, but instead of regret, he only felt anger. One day he saw Melissa by chance at a shopping mall. She was walking with shopping bags in hand, looking happy and confident. Beside her was Edward, and they were laughing about something. Her laughter sounded foreign to Clayton, like it no longer belonged to the woman he once knew. He wanted to approach them, to say something sharp and cutting, but he froze. They hadn't even noticed him. It was as if he no longer existed in their world. The realization hit harder than he expected. Melissa, on the other hand, never looked back again. She had built a life where she felt truly herself. Edward became her close friend, and later, something more than just a neighbor. A photograph of her standing on the bridge, arms outstretched, now hung on the wall in their home. It was a reminder of how far she had come and how important it was to never be afraid to move forward. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss any new videos. See you soon, dear listeners.